Imagine a vast, quiet, green valley in California, a place where nearly 100,000 acres once grew nothing but cherry, plum, and apricot orchards. In spring, when the trees bloomed, it looked as though the entire valley had been covered in snow. They called it, lovingly, the Valley of Heart's Delight.
Today, on that very same soil, the headquarters of the world's biggest technology companies now stand. The orchard soil gives birth to trillion-dollar startups and unicorns. But the story you've been told, generation after generation, about this magical transformation, almost all of it is a carefully constructed myth.
Two brilliant friends in a garage, an idea, and the magic of free market capitalism turning it into the biggest company on Earth. It's a story that sounds wonderful, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. Silicon Valley was never the spontaneous creation of a free market. Its real architect was America's military-industrial complex and the defense budgets of the Cold War. And today, after decades of selling social media and consumer apps, Silicon Valley is heading straight back to its roots. It is preparing for war. Again. This story matters to you more than you might think, because a handful of venture capitalists sitting on one small street, Sand Hill Road, decide which technologies you'll be using for the next decade. They shape our society, our economy, and global politics. To understand how this system actually works, we have to go back to the years right after the Second World War.
In the 1930s and 40s, this region was purely agricultural. But a Stanford engineering professor named Fred Terman realized that fruit and farming alone could never build this region's future. He watched his brightest students being forced east, chasing jobs the valley simply couldn't offer them.
So he encouraged his students, William Hewlett and David Packard, to start a company of their own. In 1951, he leased a stretch of Stanford's land to create the Stanford Industrial Park. But the real customer for this new industry wasn't ordinary consumers. Their biggest customer was the Pentagon.
During the Cold War, keeping pace with the Soviet Union meant America needed cutting-edge radar, missile guidance systems, and satellite technology, and the Department of Defense opened the floodgates of funding. Historians put it bluntly, Silicon Valley's first and biggest venture capitalist was the American military. It was on the back of these defense contracts that the Valley built its first technological foundations.
Right around this time, in 1956, William Shockley, co-inventor of the transistor and a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, returned to the Valley to found Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. He recruited some of the country's sharpest young engineers, but he was a brutal, paranoid manager. Within a year, the environment had grown so toxic that his 8 best engineers rebelled and walked out together. History remembers them as the Traitorous Eight. Those 8 engineers wanted to build a semiconductor company of their own. But in the 1950s, banks simply didn't lend money to unproven, risky ventures. That's when a young financial analyst from New York, Arthur Rock, entered the picture. He heard their story, flew out to California, and decided to bet on them. He pitched nearly 30 companies before finally securing $1.5 million from a businessman named Sherman Fairchild. Fairchild Semiconductor was born. But the real innovation in that deal wasn't a silicon chip. It was equity, ownership.
Arthur Rock offered these engineers a stake in the company itself, something almost unheard of in the corporate world at the time. That single move gave birth to the modern venture capital industry, and Arthur Rock himself popularized the term venture capitalist. Fairchild Semiconductor became a runaway success, so much so that its culture of equity and independent thinking spawned Intel, AMD, and hundreds of other companies, founded by employees who walked out the door. History calls them the Fair Children.
So here's the obvious question. Boston's Route 128 corridor had its own massive tech hub back then, backed by MIT and Harvard. So why did California's fruit orchards win in the end? The answer is a legal loophole, one that completely by accident became one of the greatest engines of innovation ever created. In Massachusetts, non-compete agreements were rigorously enforced. Leave a company and you couldn't join a competitor for years. But in California, under Section 16600, a law dating back to 1872, binding an employee with a non-compete was simply illegal. Which meant a top engineer at Fairchild or Intel could resign one day and launch a rival startup the next. That legal freedom turned job hopping into a defining culture of Silicon Valley, and it triggered something called knowledge spillover, where one company's secrets spread across the entire valley almost overnight, supercharging innovation for everyone. To cash in on all that innovation, an entire empire of venture capital firms rose up along Sand Hill Road. And this is where we need to look at an uncomfortable truth, the real economics of how venture capital actually makes its money. Most VC funds run on what's known as the 2 and 20 fee structure. Here's the simple version. Say a VC fund raises $100 million with a 10-year lifespan. Every year, they take 2% of the total fund, $2 million, as a management fee. Over 10 years, that's $20 million pocketed for salaries, office space, and overhead, guaranteed, whether their startups succeed or collapse entirely. Then, when the fund sells its stakes or profits through an IPO, after returning investors' original capital, it keeps 20% of whatever profit remains, known as carried interest, or carry. The whole model is governed by a brutal power law. VCs know full well that 7 or 8 out of every 10 startups they back will fail completely. But they don't dwell on the failures. They're hunting for one thing only: the black swan, the unicorn, the single bet that returns 1000x. That extreme math is exactly why VCs push their startups toward unnatural, breakneck growth. There's no room here for slow, steady, profitable business. Hypergrowth or die. This aggressive model is exactly what fueled the consumer internet and social media boom, from the dot-com bubble to today's AI hype cycle. The entire ecosystem is built on a foundation of financial speculation. Right now, America's private unicorns, its billion-dollar startups, carry a combined valuation of roughly $4.4 trillion. Many of them have never turned a single dollar of profit. They're simply burning venture capital to buy market share. We tend to assume Silicon Valley's only real goal is innovation and global connection. In the 2000s, companies like Google and Facebook constantly insisted they wanted to make the world more open and connected. Big tech presented itself less like a corporation and more like a global public good, deliberately keeping its distance from military contracts. In 2018, Google's own employees forced the company to abandon its work on the Pentagon's Project Maven drone program. But now, the picture has completely reversed. The consumer internet, food delivery, and social media markets are saturated. VCs like Peter Thiel have argued for years that there are no major breakthroughs left in consumer tech. So, to protect their trillion-dollar growth, venture capitalists are heading back to their roots. And Silicon Valley is now openly leaning into defense technology. They've realized the Pentagon's enormous budget could be their next 1000x return. Between 2019 and 2024, venture capital investment in defense tech startups grew tenfold, reaching nearly $3 billion. Companies like Palantir and Palmer Luckey's Anduril are now among the Pentagon's closest, most trusted partners. They're using artificial intelligence to build smart drones, autonomous weapons, and mass surveillance systems, and VC funds are pouring in billions of dollars to fund it. One example makes the shift impossible to ignore. Y Combinator, the world's most respected startup accelerator, once behind consumer names like Airbnb, DoorDash, and Reddit, is now investing directly in weapons manufacturing.
In 2024, they backed a defense startup called Traitorous Industries, whose core mission is building cheap anti-ship cruise missiles for a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait. Its founder's bio once simply read, "Missiles are cool." Now, take a step back and look at the whole picture. From fruit orchards to transistors to consumer apps to today's AI-driven weapons, this entire century-long journey has really been one continuous process. A small number of powerful people compounding their capital. The venture capitalists of Sand Hill Road pocket guaranteed management fees and gamble with other people's money. But the real cost of that gamble may end up being paid by the rest of the world. The Valley of Heart's Delight once grew food for people. That same soil has now become trillion-dollar algorithms and weapons systems that shape the world's wars and control humanity's data. Will Silicon Valley's newest transformation lead us toward a safer future or push us toward disaster? Maybe even the investors of Sand Hill Road don't know the answer.